On my 72nd birthday, my son said, "I'm selling your house. One small room is enough for you." I just smiled and said, "Okay, dear." He didn't know that the house actually belonged to, when he brought the buyers, his face. Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way, I can see how far my story has traveled. People always ask me what it feels like to turn 72. I used to say it felt like finally earning the right to drink your morning coffee while it's still hot, without anyone needing something from you. That was before that Tuesday in October. Before everything I thought I understood about my son turned out to be wrong. My name is Margaret Calloway. Most people call me Maggie. I have lived in the same white house on Birchwood Lane in Dayton, Ohio, for 41 years. My late husband, Frank, built the back porch with his own hands in the summer of 1987. He painted it barn red. I still sit on it every morning, watching the maple tree he planted drop its leaves each fall, and I still think of him every single time. Frank passed in 2019. A stroke, quick and without warning, the way he would have wanted. He always said he'd go out like a light switch, not like a candle. He was right. After the funeral, my son Dennis moved back into town with his wife, Brenda. At first, I was grateful. The house felt too big, too quiet. Dennis helped with repairs. Brenda brought casseroles. They came by on Sundays. For a while, it felt like the family was closing ranks the way families are supposed to after loss. But things have a way of shifting without you noticing. The casseroles stopped. The Sunday visits became shorter. When they did come, Dennis always seemed distracted, his eyes moving through the rooms like he was calculating something. Brenda would stand in the kitchen, running her fingers along the granite countertops as though she were appraising them. I told myself I was imagining things. Old women imagine things. That's what I told myself. The first real signal came in the spring, 8 months before that October Tuesday. Dennis mentioned casually over the phone that the housing market in Dayton was incredible right now. I agreed. It was. He then asked, equally casually, whether I had ever thought about simplifying. I said I didn't know what he meant. He said something about how the house was a lot for one person to maintain. I said I managed fine. The conversation moved on, but I did not forget it. Over the summer, there were other small things. Dennis asked me twice if I had updated my will since Frank passed. I told him yes, that Eleanor Voss, my attorney, had handled everything, and it was all in order. He seemed unsatisfied with that answer, but did not push. Brenda once asked, over a glass of wine in my living room, whether I'd considered those lovely senior communities out by the lake. I smiled and said I was quite attached to my maple tree. She smiled back, but her eyes did not. By September, I had started to pay closer attention. I noticed Dennis photographing rooms with his phone when he thought I wasn't looking. I noticed that he began mentioning a man named Gary Sutter, a local developer, in passing. Just Gary this, Gary that. Like the name was supposed to mean something to me. I filed it away quietly. I had learned in 72 years that the most useful thing you can do with information is hold it until you know what it's worth. Then came that Tuesday in October. Dennis arrived at 11 in the morning, unannounced. Brenda was with him. They sat down at my kitchen table. My kitchen table, where Frank and I had eaten 30 years of dinners. And Dennis folded his hands and looked at me with that particular expression I recognized from when he was a teenager, about to tell me something he'd already decided. "Mom," he said, "I've been thinking about this for a long time, and I think it's time to be honest with you. This house is too much. It's too big, too expensive to keep up, and frankly, it's sitting on real estate that could change both our lives." He paused. "I'm going to sell it. You'll have more than enough for a nice room somewhere. You don't need all of this." I looked at him. Then I looked at Brenda, who was studying her hands. A room. 72 years old, and my son was offering me a room. I took a breath. I set down my coffee cup and I smiled. "All right, dear," I said, "if that's what you think is best." He blinked. He had expected argument. He had not expected agreement. I watched something flicker behind his eyes. Relief, maybe, or the first faint shadow of suspicion, but mostly relief. He was so certain he already had what he wanted that he didn't think to ask the one question that would have changed everything. He did not ask whose name was actually on the deed. After Dennis and Brenda left, I sat at that kitchen table for a long time without moving. The coffee went cold. The maple tree outside the window stood still in the gray October air, and I watched it and thought about Frank. And I thought about everything 41 years in one house means. The height marks penciled on the door frame when Dennis was growing up. The window Frank replaced twice because we always bought cheap. The root cellar where I still kept jars of tomato preserves from last summer's garden. I thought about all of it, and I let myself feel afraid. I think it's important to let yourself feel afraid when the situation calls for it. People act like fear is weakness. It isn't. Fear is information. It tells you exactly how much something matters to you. And I was afraid. Not because Dennis could actually do what he said. I already knew he couldn't. Not without a fight he hadn't planned for. But because something had broken that morning that could not be repaired. My son had sat at my kitchen table and looked me in the face and told me I was a problem to be solved. That he had been moving toward this moment for months, possibly longer, while I made him coffee and asked about his work, and pretended not to see the way his eyes measured my walls. That fear, the fear of having been so thoroughly underestimated by your own child, that was what sat with me at that table. I gave myself until sunset to be afraid. Then I got up, washed the cups, and made a list. Frank always said I was the planner in our marriage. He was the builder, the fixer, the man who could look at a broken thing and know intuitively what it needed. But I was the one who thought 3 steps ahead. I had run the household finances for 4 decades. I had managed Frank's medical care in his last 2 years when the small TIAs started and he stopped being able to keep track. I was not, despite what Dennis seemed to believe, a woman who could be managed. The first thing I wrote on my list was Eleanor Voss. Eleanor had been our family attorney since 1998. She had handled Frank's estate after he died, had updated my will and trust documents, had advised me quietly and carefully through every legal matter I had faced in the past 30 years. More importantly, she was sharp, methodical, and completely outside Dennis's awareness. He knew I had an attorney. He did not know how much Eleanor and I had discussed, or how recently. The second thing I wrote was, "Confirm the deed." I knew what was on it. Frank and I had taken care of everything, but I needed the documents in my hands, physical copies, in a place Dennis couldn't access. The house on Birchwood Lane was in my name alone, had been since 2017, when Frank and I had done a full estate restructuring on Eleanor's advice after a neighbor of ours lost her home to her son's creditors following a lawsuit. Frank had insisted. "We're not leaving anything to chance," he said. I had never told Dennis about that restructuring. There had been no reason to, until now. The third thing I wrote was, document everything, every conversation, every visit, every photograph Dennis had taken of my rooms. I didn't know yet exactly how I would use it, but I knew I would need it. I had been watching the pattern long enough to understand that what happened that morning was not an isolated moment. It was the surface of something that had been building for a long time, and whatever came next would require evidence, I called Eleanor the following morning. I told her what had happened. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Maggie, how soon can you come in?" I went that Thursday. Eleanor's office was in a brown brick building on 5th Street, the kind of office that had good wood paneling and bad coffee, and made you feel immediately that serious people worked there. She had already pulled my file. She walked me through everything: the deed, the trust structure, Frank's estate records. The house was mine entirely and legally. Dennis had no claim, no co-ownership, no standing to sell anything. "The question," Eleanor said carefully, setting down her glasses, "is not whether he can do this. He cannot. The question is what you want to do about the fact that he tried." I looked at her. Outside her window, 5th Street was gray and ordinary. People walking with their heads down against the autumn cold. "I want to be ready," I said, "for whatever he does next." Eleanor nodded slowly. "Then let's get ready." We spent 2 hours going over every scenario. What if he contacted a realtor? What if he tried to pressure me into signing something? What if he brought in Gary Sutter? The developer's name had made Eleanor's expression shift slightly when I mentioned it. A small, controlled tightening that told me she recognized it. What if Dennis escalated? For each question, we built an answer. By the time I walked out of Eleanor's office into the cold October air, I had a plan. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't a confrontation or a declaration. It was quiet, methodical preparation. Exactly the kind my son had never bothered to anticipate. He thought he'd already won. He thought my smile at the kitchen table meant I was going to let him have what he wanted. He didn't know me at all. The first official step was the simplest one, and I took it the following week. Eleanor had advised me to request a formal title search, a clean, current record of ownership, through the county recorder's office, and to have a certified copy sent to her office, as well as to a secure postal box I rented specifically for this purpose. It was a straightforward procedure, the kind anyone could do, but it created a paper trail that established, with a date stamp, that I had affirmatively confirmed my ownership of the property. "If this ever goes to court," Eleanor told me, "that date matters." I also did something Eleanor had not suggested, but approved of when I told her. I called the Dayton Housing Authority to request a document confirming the current assessed value of the property and the owner of record. The woman on the phone read back my name without hesitation. Margaret Ann Calloway, sole owner. I thanked her and wrote down her name in the small notebook I had started keeping in my cardigan pocket. The notebook was becoming important. Each evening, I sat at the kitchen table and wrote down every interaction: the date, the time, what was said, by whom. It sounds perhaps excessive, but I had lived long enough to know that memory is unreliable, and impressions are not evidence. Facts are evidence. Times and dates and direct quotations are evidence. On the Thursday of that week, Dennis called. "Just checking in," he said, in that particular voice he used when he was doing something other than checking in. He asked how I was feeling. He asked whether I'd thought any more about the plan. I told him I was comfortable and that I trusted he would handle things when the time came. He seemed satisfied with that. Before he hung up, he mentioned that he'd been talking to a realtor, a woman named Carol Dempsey at Dayton Premier Realty, and that she was very excited about the Birchwood property. I wrote that down. Carol Dempsey, Dayton Premier Realty. I also noted his exact phrasing, the Birchwood property. Not your house, Mom. Not the house. The Birchwood property. Like it was already an asset in a transaction he'd completed in his head. That same evening, I called Ruth. Ruth Hansen had been my closest friend for 37 years. We had met at a school fundraiser when Dennis and her daughter Kim were in the 3rd grade, and we had stayed close through marriages and losses, and the ordinary accumulation of decades. Ruth was a retired school teacher from Kettering, sharp, funny, and almost constitutionally incapable of keeping secrets from me, while simultaneously being completely trustworthy with the ones that mattered. I told her what was happening. She was quiet for a long moment. "Maggie," she finally said, "that boy has his father's stubbornness and none of his father's sense." I laughed for the first time in 2 weeks. She came over Saturday morning, and we drank coffee on the red porch Frank had built, and I told her everything. Ruth listened in the way she always listened, completely, without interrupting, letting the whole picture form before she said a word. When I finished, she set down her cup and said, "What do you need from me?" "I need a witness," I said. "I need someone who knows what's happening in real time, in case things get difficult." She reached over and patted my hand. "I've been your witness for 37 years, she said. "I'm not going anywhere." The direct evidence came on a Wednesday, 11 days after Dennis's kitchen table announcement. I had suspected it might come by mail. Dennis was old-fashioned enough for that, or maybe Brenda was. I was never entirely sure who was driving this. But it came by email. Dennis had sent it to an address I used for family correspondence, not my primary account. It was from a man named Gary Sutter, the same name Dennis had been casually dropping for months, and Dennis had forwarded it to me, apparently by mistake, or perhaps deliberately, as a form of pressure. Either way, it was now in my inbox. The email from Gary Sutter to Dennis was dated 6 weeks earlier. It outlined a preliminary offer for the Birchwood Lane property. It referenced conversations between Sutter and Dennis going back to the spring. It included language about clearing title and managing family complications, a phrase that made the skin on the back of my hands tighten. And it outlined a proposed timeline for closing that had Dennis receiving a check and the property transferring to Sutter Development, LLC, within 90 days. There was one more line at the bottom of the email. "Dennis, confirm that the property owner is cooperative or advise on alternative approaches. We've handled situations like this before." I read that line 3 times. Then I forwarded the entire email chain to Eleanor Voss. She called me within the hour. Her voice was measured and careful, but I had known Eleanor long enough to hear what was underneath. "Maggie," she said, "this changes things. This isn't just a difficult family conversation anymore. This email shows premeditation, coordination with a third party, and potentially the intent to act against your legal interests without your informed consent. I want you to understand what that means." "It means he planned this," I said. "It means he planned this," she confirmed. I was sitting on the red porch when she called. The maple tree was bare by then, its branches black against the gray November sky. I looked at it for a long time after Eleanor and I finished talking. Frank had planted that tree the year Dennis was born. He had said, the day he put it in the ground, that he wanted Dennis to watch it grow up with him. I wondered if Dennis had any memory of that at all. I closed my notebook. I looked at the bare tree, and I understood with complete clarity that there was no version of this that ended with things going back to the way they were. The point of no return was already behind me. The only direction left was forward. Eleanor moved quickly. That was one of the things I had always valued about her. She did not believe in delays when delays only benefited the other side. Within 3 days of receiving the forwarded email, she had filed a formal notice with the county recorder's office placing a legal hold annotation on the deed to the Birchwood Lane property. It was not a lien, it was a protective notation, a flag that would appear on any title search initiated by a third party. clearly indicating active legal counsel and pending review. It meant that if Carol Dempsey at Dayton Premier Realty ran a standard title check, as any realtor would before proceeding with a listing, she would see it immediately. Any serious buyer would see it. Gary Sutter's people would see it. It was a quiet move, but it had teeth. Eleanor also drafted a formal letter to Dennis, sent by certified mail, advising him in precise legal language that the property at Birchwood Lane was solely owned by Margaret Ann Calloway, that no authorization to list, represent, or negotiate the sale of said property had been granted to any party, and that any further attempts to engage realtors, developers, or buyers regarding said property without the owner's written consent would be treated as tortious interference and potentially elder financial abuse under Ohio Revised Code, Section 2913.02. That letter arrived at Dennis's house on a Friday. He called me that same evening. The voice that called was not the voice that had been checking in. This was a harder voice, one I recognized from his teenage years, the voice he used when he was cornered and knew it. "What did you do?" he said. I told him I had spoken with my attorney and taken appropriate steps to protect my interests. "Your interests?" His tone shifted, incredulous, then quickly into something colder. "Mom, I'm trying to help you. This house is falling apart. You can't manage it alone. I'm your son. I'm the one who's going to have to take care of you when you can't anymore. The least you could do—" "Dennis," I said, "everything I need to say has been said through Eleanor. If you'd like to discuss anything further, please contact her office." He hung up. 3 days later, they came in person. It was a Sunday afternoon, early November, cold and flat-skied the way Ohio gets before the first real snow. Dennis and Brenda arrived at 2 o'clock. I had been expecting them, though not necessarily that day. I had told Ruth the day before that I thought they would come soon. She had offered to be there. I had said I wanted to face this first round alone. I opened the door before Dennis knocked. Brenda had dressed carefully. A blouse I hadn't seen before, lipstick. Dennis was in his good coat. They came in and stood in my living room, and Dennis began talking, quickly, in the voice of a man who had rehearsed. He told me Eleanor's letter was extreme and unnecessary. He told me he had spoken to Gary Sutter, who was a reputable developer, a good man, someone who could make this situation beneficial for everyone. He told me that a certain amount of money from the sale could be held in trust for my ongoing care, that he had thought of everything, that he was doing this because he loved me. Then Brenda said, quietly and deliberately, the thing I suspected she had come specifically to say. "Maggie, Dennis and I have talked to Dr. Harmon. We're concerned about your ability to make decisions like this on your own. We think, just as a precaution, it might be worth discussing a formal capacity evaluation." There it was, a capacity evaluation. The suggestion that perhaps I was no longer mentally fit to manage my own affairs, which would, if successful, allow them to pursue guardianship or a power of attorney, which would give them legal authority over my decisions, including decisions about property. I looked at Brenda for a long moment. Then I looked at Dennis. "I spoke to Dr. Harmon myself last week," I said. "Routine annual checkup. She gave me a clean bill of health. I'll have her office send a summary to Eleanor if you'd like to have it on record." The silence that followed was complete. Dennis's jaw tightened. Brenda looked at her hands. "This doesn't have to be a war," Dennis said finally. "No," I agreed. "It doesn't." They left 20 minutes later. After they were gone, I sat on the red porch in my winter coat for a long time. The maple tree stood bare and still in the cold. My hands were perfectly steady, but somewhere behind my sternum, there was a persistent, low-grade ache. Not quite grief, not quite fear. Something closer to the feeling you get when you finally admit to yourself that a thing you loved is already gone. I gave myself 4 days. I called Ruth. I slept. I tended to the garden's last tasks before winter. I baked the apple cake I made every November. I sat with Frank's photograph on the mantelpiece and told him, out loud, what was happening, the way I always talked to him when things were hard. On the 5th morning, I got up early, made coffee, and called Eleanor. I'm ready for the next step, I told her. The temptation came by way of an envelope. It arrived on a Tuesday morning, courier delivery. A thick, cream-colored envelope with Dennis and Brenda's return address and a small note attached in Brenda's careful handwriting. Mom, please read this with an open mind. We only want what's best for everyone. Inside was a formal document, not a legal brief, but a personal proposal, 8 pages, typed and organized into sections with headings. It outlined a family property resolution plan. It proposed that I voluntarily transfer the Birchwood Lane property into a jointly held family trust, co-administered by Dennis, in exchange for a guaranteed residential annuity that would cover my living expenses and provide me with a comfortable private suite in a senior residence of my choosing. The document was detailed, thorough, and dressed in the language of care. It used phrases like dignified transition and collaborative stewardship and ensuring Maggie's comfort and security. I read it twice. Then I set it on the kitchen table and looked at it from a slight distance, the way you look at a thing when you want to see it clearly. It was well written. That was the first thing I noticed. Brenda, I suspected, had spent considerable time on it. The organization, the measured tone, the careful avoidance of anything overtly threatening. If I were a different kind of woman, a lonelier one, or one more accustomed to being directed rather than doing the directing, I might have found it almost reasonable. The language of care has a particular pull when you're 72 and living alone and the cold comes through the old window frames at night. But I had been watching Dennis's eyes in my kitchen for months. I had read Gary Sutter's email. I had heard Brenda suggest a capacity evaluation in my own living room as though it were a kindness. I knew what this document was underneath its headings. I sent it to Eleanor that afternoon. Her response came the next morning. 2 sentences. I've reviewed it. Do not sign anything. I hadn't intended to. What I found more interesting was what the proposal told me about where they were now. They had escalated twice. The kitchen table confrontation, the Sunday visit with its implicit threat. And both times I had not buckled. Now they were trying a different approach, softer, more patient. This told me something important. They were not certain of their ground. People who are certain don't negotiate. They simply act. I shared this reasoning with Ruth when she came over on Wednesday. We were in the kitchen, coffee on, the November light flat and clean through the window above the sink, and I watched Ruth read the proposal with the expression of a woman who had spent 30 years managing a classroom full of children, trying to talk their way out of consequences. My God, she said when she finished. They actually used the phrase dignified transition. 3 times, I said. Ruth put the document down. Maggie, you know what this is, don't you? This is what people do when they know they've lost the argument and they're hoping you'll be too tired to keep fighting. They dress it up so it feels like a reasonable solution, and the whole thing depends on you not noticing that you're still losing. I nodded. I had known it from the moment I opened the envelope. But it helped to hear Ruth say it plainly, out loud, in my kitchen. Because it confirmed that I was not imagining things, was not being unreasonable, was not the difficult, confused old woman they were counting on me to become. That same week, Ruth did something I hadn't expected and hadn't asked for, but which turned out to matter enormously. She spoke to her daughter Kim, who was a social worker in Montgomery County, and asked her discreetly about resources for seniors facing family financial pressure. Kim contacted the Montgomery County Adult Protective Services Resource Line on my behalf. Not to file a complaint, not yet, but to establish a record that I had sought guidance and to connect me with a senior legal advocacy coordinator named Patricia Owens. I met Patricia for coffee on Friday at a diner on Salem Avenue. She was a compact, direct woman in her late 40s, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the practiced attention of someone who had heard every version of every story. I told her mine. She listened. When I finished, she asked several precise questions about the email, about the certified letter, about the capacity evaluation suggestion. Then she told me about Ohio's elder financial abuse statutes, about what constituted a pattern of coercive behavior, and about what documentation I should ensure was preserved. She also told me something I hadn't considered. In situations like this, she said, the most important thing is often visibility. When family members believe no one is watching, they tend to escalate. When they understand that their actions are documented, observed, and known to parties outside the family, they frequently recalculate. I thought about that on the drive home. Visibility. I had been quiet and careful, and those were the right instincts. But perhaps it was time to be visible as well. I called Eleanor that evening and told her I wanted to explore one additional step. She listened. She said it was worth considering. Dennis and Brenda were watching, I knew, waiting. They had sent their proposal and were hoping for a sign of softening. They were watching for a crack. I sat on the red porch in the cold and looked at the bare maple tree, and I felt something settle in me. Not coldness exactly, more like clarity. The kind of quiet you feel when you've stopped fighting the situation and simply begun to work through it, step by step, because you know exactly what you're doing and why. I had all the time in the world. They were the ones who were running out of it. They came back on a Saturday in late November, 11 days after the proposal envelope. Dennis called the morning of to say he and Brenda wanted to stop by, that they hoped we could talk like a family, that he missed me, and this whole thing had gotten out of hand. His voice was softer than it had been in weeks. I recognized the register. I had heard it when he was 16 and had broken a window with a baseball and wanted to frame it as an accident rather than carelessness. It was his conciliatory voice, and like everything else about this period, it told me more than he intended. I said they were welcome to come. Ruth offered, again, to be present. I thanked her and said I would call her right after. I wanted to see this clearly, without a buffer. They arrived at 1. Brenda had brought a coffee cake from the bakery on Far Hills Avenue, a gesture that under other circumstances would have been simply kind. They sat down in my living room, and Dennis began. He said he was sorry. He said he had handled things badly, had moved too fast, had not communicated the way he should have. He said he loved me, and that this situation had caused him real grief, that he lay awake at night worrying about me alone in this big house. He said he understood why I'd felt the need to involve an attorney, but that he hoped we could now step back from the legal posture and talk as a family. It was a good performance, I gave it that. I sat in Frank's chair. I always sit in Frank's chair when I need to feel steady. And I listened to all of it, and I said, when he finished, "Dennis, I appreciate that. I do." Then Brenda leaned forward slightly in that way she had, chin tilted, voice measured. "Maggie, we want to be honest with you, because we love you." She paused. "We've spoken to a family law attorney, and what we've been told is that a petition for guardianship, given the circumstances, your age, living alone, some of the concerns we've raised about judgment and decision-making, It's a process that's available to us. We're not saying we want to go that route. Another pause. But it's something the court would have to evaluate. And that process, the evaluation, the hearings, it can be very stressful for the person being assessed. Very public. We would hate for you to have to go through that. There it was, wrapped in 4 layers of concern and softness. But there it was, a threat. I looked at Brenda. I looked at Dennis, who was looking at the floor. I thought about the coffee cake on the kitchen counter, and about how someone had taken the time to buy it and carry it here and set it out as a prop in this scene. I thought about Frank's chair under me, solid and familiar. I understand, I said. Maggie, we just need you to trust us. I do understand what you're describing, I said, more deliberately now. And I want you both to understand something. I have a letter from Dr. Harmon documenting my full cognitive and physical health as of November 6th. I have 37 years of financial records showing consistent, competent management of this household and Frank's estate. I have the counsel of Eleanor Voss, who has represented me since 1998. And I have Patricia Owens at Montgomery County Adult Protective Services, who is familiar with this situation. I let that land. A guardianship petition filed against a woman with that record, represented by that attorney, with that documentation, and with an active APS contact. That would be a very difficult case to make, and a very public one. For everyone. The room was quiet. Dennis looked up from the floor. His face had changed. The performance was over. You've really thought all this through, he said, and the bitterness in it was naked. I've had time, I said. They left shortly after. Dennis didn't say goodbye. Brenda paused at the door and said, quietly, "This didn't have to be this way." I didn't answer. After the door closed, I stood in the hallway for a moment. My heart was beating faster than I would have liked. I won't pretend I was entirely unmoved. There is something specifically terrible about being threatened by your own child in your own home. Something that no amount of preparation fully insulates you from. The threat of public hearings, of being evaluated and assessed, and found wanting. It pressed on something old and vulnerable in me. But then I felt the fear sharpen into something else. I thought of the Gary Sutter email and managing family complications. I thought of Brenda's fingers on my kitchen countertops. I thought of Dennis at 8 years old, asleep under the maple tree on a summer afternoon, while Frank watched him from the porch and said quietly, "He's going to be fine, Maggie. He just needs time." What a different kind of fine he had found. The fear settled into determination. I went to Frank's chair and sat in it again, and I thought clearly, and I picked up the phone and called Eleanor. "They just left," I said. "It's time to move." Eleanor had been ready for 2 weeks. The meeting was scheduled for a Wednesday, which seemed appropriate somehow. A middle-of-the-week kind of reckoning. Nothing dramatic in its timing, just the ordinary machinery of consequence finally engaging. Eleanor had arranged for it to be held in the conference room of her office on 5th Street. She had notified Dennis, through formal written communication, that his presence was requested regarding the property at Birchwood Lane and matters pertaining to his communications with Gary Sutter and Dayton Premier Realty. She had kept the language neutral and procedural. She had not told him who else would be there. I arrived 20 minutes early. Eleanor was already in the conference room. Ruth was there too. I had asked her to come, and she had dressed as though she were going to a parent-teacher conference she intended to win. Patricia Owens joined us at 10 past the hour, and, at my request, Eleanor had also contacted the Dayton office of Ohio's Attorney General Consumer Protection Division, who had sent a representative, a quiet, careful young man named Daniel Ferris, who sat at the end of the table with a notepad and said almost nothing. Dennis and Brenda arrived together at 10:30. They saw the room. They saw Ruth. They saw Patricia Owens. They saw Daniel Ferris with his notepad and his neutral expression. I watched Dennis's face move through 3 or 4 different versions of itself in the space of about 2 seconds. Brenda stopped in the doorway as though the room had changed into something she hadn't agreed to enter. Eleanor offered them seats. They sat. Then Eleanor did what Eleanor does best. She laid out documents one by one with the unhurried precision of a woman who has spent 30 years in rooms like this and has never once felt the need to raise her voice. The deed to the Birchwood Lane property. Sole ownership, Margaret Ann Calloway. Date of restructuring, March 2017. Signed and notarized. The forwarded email from Gary Sutter to Dennis, dated 6 weeks before the kitchen table conversation. The line about managing family complications was highlighted in yellow. A timeline of events, beginning with Dennis's first mention of simplifying the previous spring, compiled from my notebook. Dates, times, direct quotations. The records from Carol Dempsey's initial inquiry at the county recorder's office, showing she had run a title search on the property, a search she had no legitimate authorization to conduct, given that the owner had granted no such permission. The formal certified letter and Dennis's phone response. The proposal document with its 3 uses of dignified transition. The Saturday visit. The guardianship threat. Ruth's notes, which I had asked her to make immediately after my phone call to her that evening, documenting what I had told her word for word. And finally, a brief from Patricia Owens's office characterizing the pattern of behavior as meeting several criteria under Ohio's definition of attempted elder financial exploitation. Dennis tried to speak 3 times during this presentation. The first time, Eleanor simply continued. The second time, she paused and looked at him with the expression of a woman who has all the time in the world and needs nothing from him. The third time, he stopped himself. When Eleanor finished, the conference room was quiet for a long moment. Then Dennis said, You're making this into something it isn't. I was trying to help her. I was worried about her. You can't. This isn't financial abuse. I'm her son. Your son's status does not provide legal authority over her property, Eleanor said, without heat. I didn't do anything illegal. The coordination with Gary Sutter prior to obtaining any ownership authorization, the title search conducted through Carol Dempsey without the owner's consent, the suggestion of a capacity evaluation as leverage in a property dispute. Individually, these may have varying legal weight. Together, as a pattern, Mr. Calloway, they constitute a significantly more serious matter. Dennis looked at me. It was the first time he'd really looked at me since sitting down. Mom, he said, and the voice was different now. Younger, almost, and more frightened. Mom, I wasn't trying to. I had thought about what I would say at this moment. I had imagined it several ways. But sitting there in that room, looking at my son's face with all its collapsed certainty, I found I didn't want to say anything sharp or conclusive. I just wanted to be honest. Dennis, I said, you decided I was finished, that I was something to be managed. You made plans about my home, my life, my future, for months without asking me a single question. I paused. I am not finished. Brenda put her hand on the table and said, in a tight, controlled voice, we should not have come here without our own attorney. That, Eleanor said pleasantly, is almost certainly correct. They gathered their things. Dennis pushed his chair back. He stood up, and I could see that he was trying to find somewhere to put the experience, somewhere it would fit into the version of himself he had arrived with. There was nowhere for it to go. Daniel Ferris, at the end of the table, wrote something on his notepad. Dennis and Brenda left without speaking. The door to the conference room closed with a soft, ordinary click. I sat for a moment. Ruth put her hand over mine. "All right?" she asked. "Yes," I said, and I meant it. The weeks that followed were not dramatic. That was perhaps the most significant thing about them. Eleanor filed a formal complaint with the Ohio Attorney General's Consumer Protection Office, referencing the Sutter correspondence and the pattern of behavior documented in the timeline. Daniel Ferris, the representative who had attended our meeting, followed up within 10 days. Gary Sutter, it turned out, had an existing record of regulatory complaints in Cuyahoga County involving similar acquisition strategies. The Birchwood Lane matter was added to an active investigation. Carol Dempsey at Dayton Premier Realty received a formal cease and desist regarding any further activity in connection with the property. Her broker's response, when Eleanor notified them of the unauthorized title search, was swift and apologetic. Whether Carol Dempsey understood that she had been used as an instrument in someone else's scheme, I couldn't say. But she had no further involvement. Dennis hired an attorney, a man named Warren Fields, who had the tired look of a lawyer accustomed to clients who had significantly overestimated their position. Warren Fields and Eleanor exchanged correspondence for approximately 3 weeks. Then he stopped responding on Dennis's behalf, which Eleanor told me typically indicated that the client had been advised to cease and desist on their own recognizance. The guardianship threat dissolved entirely. Patricia Owens had been correct. Visibility changed the calculus completely. No attorney would advance a guardianship petition against a clearly documented, legally represented, cognitively assessed woman with an active complaint record on the other side. The threat had depended on my silence. Once it was spoken aloud in a room full of witnesses, it had no power at all. Gary Sutter contacted Eleanor in early December, through his own attorney, expressing a desire to clarify the nature of his communications with Dennis Calloway. Eleanor responded with a brief letter that was essentially a closed door. His development interest in the Birchwood Lane property, she wrote, was noted, documented, and would be referenced in any ongoing proceedings. There would be no further communication. Dennis called me once in mid-December. He was quiet on the phone for a moment before he spoke, and what he said was not an apology exactly. It was something smaller, more careful. He said he thought he had been thinking about things the wrong way, that he had told himself it was about my well-being, when maybe it had been about other things. He didn't elaborate on what other things. I didn't ask. There are times when the specific accounting matters less than the acknowledgement that one was done. I told him I heard him. I told him I loved him. I told him that the door was not closed, but that things would have to be different. He said he understood. I didn't know whether that was true, but I knew it was the most honest conversation we'd had in a long time, possibly in years, and I decided to count it for what it was. The formal outcomes were clear. My ownership of the Birchwood Lane property was fully confirmed, legally annotated, and registered with the county in a way that would make any future unauthorized attempts immediately and visibly actionable. The Attorney General's inquiry continued, and while I was not the primary focus of it, my documentation had contributed to a broader case. Patricia Owens at APS closed my referral file with a notation of satisfactory resolution. Eleanor sent me a brief letter at year's end. It said, among other things, "Maggie, in 30 years of practice, I have rarely seen a client handle a situation like this with more clarity, more patience, and more strategic discipline. You should be proud." I folded the letter and put it in the cedar box on my dresser, where I kept Frank's letters. The house on Birchwood Lane was mine. It had always been mine. But now It was mine in a way that had been tested and confirmed and documented in every form that mattered. No one would question it again. I sat on the red porch on a cold December evening, wrapped in the quilt Frank's mother had made, and I looked at the bare maple tree and the stars appearing one by one above Birchwood Lane, and I felt something I want to try to describe accurately, because I think it matters. I did not feel triumphant. I felt solid, like a house after it has been reinforced from the foundation up. Unmovable. I picked up my coffee cup. It was still hot. The new year came quietly, the way good things often do. In January, I hired a young man named Tomas from the neighborhood to help with the heavier maintenance work. The gutters, the roof inspection, the basement windows that had needed recaulking since October. He was 23, studying construction management at Sinclair, and he had the patient, careful quality of someone who took seriously the idea that a thing worth doing was worth doing right. Frank would have liked him. We developed an easy working rhythm. He would come Saturdays. I would make coffee, and we would discuss what needed doing the way two professionals discuss a shared project. The house on Birchwood Lane had never been in better order. Eleanor had suggested, and I had agreed, that it was worth updating the formal estate documents to ensure complete clarity about the future disposition of the property. I spent a morning with her in February going over the revised trust structure. When it was done, the Birchwood Lane property would eventually pass to a combination of charitable endowments, a scholarship fund at the Dayton Public Library System, where I had volunteered for 15 years, and a preservation grant for the Ohio Historical Farmstead Program that Frank had always supported. There was also a modest personal bequest, structured carefully and with conditions. Dennis was not excluded, but he was not the primary beneficiary he had apparently anticipated. Ruth and I resumed our regular Thursday morning coffees at the kitchen table, which we had let lapse during the difficult months when every conversation had been dominated by the crisis. We talked about her grandchildren, about the book club we both attended at the library, about the particular quality of Dayton winter light that we had, over decades, come to find genuinely beautiful rather than merely endurable. It felt like coming back to myself. I also began, that spring, to write, not a memoir exactly. I was not ready for that, and may never be. But notes, observations. The story of those months on Birchwood Lane, written in longhand in the same kind of notebook I had kept during the crisis. Patricia Owens had mentioned, when we spoke in March, that she often wished she had first-hand accounts from the individuals who had navigated situations like mine. Not as legal documents, but as human documents, the kind that might help someone else recognize what was happening to them before it went too far. I thought about that. As for Dennis and Brenda, I know what you're wondering, and I will tell you honestly. Dennis lost his position at the logistics company where he'd worked for 9 years in the spring, part of a broader restructuring that had nothing to do with our situation. He was not, as far as I knew, targeted or punished because of it. It was genuinely coincidental. But it meant that the financial position he had apparently been counting on, the position that had perhaps made the Birchwood Lane scheme feel both necessary and possible, was no longer there. He spent several months looking for work. It was a difficult period for him. Gary Sutter's development firm faced a formal investigation by the Ohio Attorney General's office. 3 other property owners in the region came forward with similar accounts of coordinated pressure campaigns targeting older adults with valuable real estate. The investigation resulted in a consent order requiring Sutter Development, LLC, to adopt new compliance protocols and pay restitution to 2 of the other complainants. Sutter himself did not go to prison, but his development projects in Montgomery County were suspended pending review. It was not, perhaps, everything that justice might have required. But it was real, and it was documented, and it was on record. Carol Dempsey left Dayton Premier Realty in April. I don't know the exact circumstances. Brenda, from what I understood, through the occasional and careful information Ruth would share, not gossip, I want to be clear, but the kind of factual update that exists between two women who have watched a situation unfold. Brenda and Dennis had a very hard year. Their marriage was strained by stress and recrimination. There were months when they weren't speaking well to each other. I learned this and felt no satisfaction in it. Only the particular sorrow of watching people pay prices. You didn't ask them to pay, even if they had brought the bill upon themselves. In November, almost exactly a year after the kitchen table, Dennis drove to Birchwood Lane alone. He sat on the red porch with me for an hour. He didn't make speeches or ask for anything. He drank the coffee I made him. He looked at the maple tree, which by then had its leaves again, that extraordinary October orange Frank had always pointed to. He was quiet for a long time. "I forgot," he said finally, "that you were a person." It was perhaps the most honest thing he had ever said to me. "I know," I said. "We did not fix everything that afternoon." You do not fix everything in an afternoon when you have broken the particular kind of trust he had broken. But we began, in the careful, tentative way that beginnings sometimes look, to find something new to build. My coffee was hot. The maple tree was brilliant orange. The red porch was solid under us both. Some things hold. Here is what I know. Do not sign anything out of exhaustion. Have your documents in order before the conversation that requires them. Know who your Eleanor is before you need her. Be afraid when fear is warranted. And then let the fear become fuel. What would you have done? If this story stayed with you, leave a comment. Share it with someone who needs to hear it. These things happen every day to people who deserve better. Thank you for being here. My husband died 6 months ago, but yesterday I saw him alive at a store. I followed him. He got into a car with another woman. She called him husband. When I walked up to them and knocked on the window, "Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. My name is Margaret Ellen Calloway. I'm 67 years old, and I've lived in the same house in Denton, Texas for 41 years. The oak tree in the backyard, the one Gerald planted the summer our daughter Karen was born, is still there. It's taller than the roof now. I used to sit under it with my morning coffee and think that some things in life are permanent. The tree, the house, my marriage. I was wrong about the last one. Gerald and I were married for 38 years. 38 years of Sunday dinners and arguments about the thermostat, and vacations to the same lake house in Arkansas every August. We had 2 children, Karen and our son Thomas, and 4 grandchildren between them. We had a retirement plan, a joint savings account, and a life insurance policy worth $400,000 that Gerald had insisted on taking out 10 years ago. "For your peace of mind, Maggie," he'd said, "in case anything happens to me." He was always very careful about that policy. I should have asked myself why. Instead, I believed him. I believed everything. When he started coming home late from his job at the property management company, I told myself it was the Henderson account, a large commercial property that had been giving him trouble for months. When he began sleeping on the far edge of the bed, turned away from me like a man guarding something private, I told myself it was his back. Gerald had always had a bad back. When he started taking his phone into the bathroom, something he'd never done in 38 years of marriage, I told myself he was watching those football highlight videos that Thomas had shown him how to find on YouTube. I told myself a great many things. There were smaller signs, too, ones I cataloged only later, in the terrible silence after. He had lost weight, perhaps 20 pounds over the course of a year, weight that made him look younger, sharper. He had bought new clothes, clothes that didn't look like Gerald at all. Fitted shirts, dark jeans, shoes that weren't the beaten New Balance sneakers he'd worn since Obama's first term. He had started going to the gym, which he called the doctor's orders, after a routine physical. He had changed the password on his laptop. But I was 66 years old and I was tired, and it is very easy when you are tired to choose the explanation that requires the least from you. Then, in February of last year, Gerald had a heart attack. That's what they told me. That's what the death certificate said. He collapsed at work, alone in his office on a Friday afternoon when his assistant had already left for the weekend. By the time anyone found him, it was too late. The paramedics, the hospital, the doctor who spoke to me in that small beige room, they all said the same thing. Massive myocardial infarction. He would not have suffered long. I buried an empty casket. The funeral director had gently explained that the condition of the body made an open casket inadvisable. I had been too destroyed to question it. I collected the life insurance. $412,000 after processing fees. I gave a portion to Karen and Thomas. I sat under the oak tree and cried until I had no more tears left, and then I cried some more. For 6 months, I grieved. And then, on a Tuesday morning in August, a bright, indifferent morning that smelled of cut grass and coming rain, I drove to the Kroger on Elm Street to buy milk, eggs, and the specific brand of herbal tea that helps me sleep. I was in the cereal aisle when I saw him. He was heavier than I remembered, or perhaps the fitted shirt made him look that way. His hair was different, shorter, with a trace of gray that I didn't recognize. He was pushing a cart, studying the back of a box of granola with the focused, slightly squinting expression I had watched him make 10,000 times over 38 years. The expression he made when he was reading without his glasses. I stopped walking. The box of tea I was holding fell to the floor. He didn't look up. He set the granola in his cart and pushed it forward and rounded the corner toward the dairy section. And I stood very still in the cereal aisle of the Kroger on Elm Street, in the town where we had lived together for 4 decades, watching my dead husband do his grocery shopping. I followed him. I don't remember making the decision. I remember that my legs moved and that the fluorescent lights above me seemed very bright and that I could hear my own breathing. He moved through the store at a comfortable pace, unhurried, pausing to add items to his cart. He looked healthy. He looked rested. He looked, I realized, with a sickness that started in my stomach and spread outward like cold water. Happy. He paid at the self-checkout and walked out into the parking lot. I followed him through the sliding doors into the August heat. A silver Honda Accord was parked in the 3rd row. A woman was sitting in the passenger seat, younger than me by perhaps 15 years, with dark hair pulled back from her face. When Gerald reached the car and opened the trunk to load his bags, she rolled down her window and said something. She was smiling. I was close enough, in that flat, carrying Texas heat, to hear exactly what she said. She said, "Did you get the good granola, husband?" And Gerald laughed. He laughed the way he used to laugh with me. Easy, comfortable, like a man entirely at home in his life. I was standing 12 feet away. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my purse. The sound made him turn. For one moment, one long, stretched, terrible moment, Gerald Calloway looked directly at me. His face went white. And then I walked to that car and I knocked on the window, and the world as I had understood it for 67 years came apart at the seams. He didn't run. I think I had expected him to run. Instead, Gerald stood very still beside the open trunk of that silver Honda, his grocery bags at his feet. and looked at me the way a man looks at something he has spent a great deal of energy pretending does not exist. The color had drained from his face completely. I could see the pulse in his throat. I had kissed that throat 10,000 times. I had pressed my ear against that chest and listened to the heart that was supposedly dead. The woman, his wife, had gotten out of the car by then. She was perhaps 50, slim, with the kind of careful, maintained appearance that speaks of effort and intention. She wore a yellow blouse. I remember the yellow blouse very clearly. She looked from Gerald to me and back to Gerald with an expression that shifted in the space of 3 seconds from confusion to something I can only describe as calculation. "Gerald," she said. Her voice was calm, too calm. He said my name. Just that, Maggie, in a voice so low it was almost nothing. "You're dead," I said. It came out very flat, very ordinary, the way you might say it's raining or the mail is here. "I buried you. I have a death certificate. I watched them put your casket in the ground at Westland Cemetery on February the 19th. He opened his mouth. He closed it again. The woman in the yellow blouse stepped forward and touched his arm. It was a proprietary gesture, the unconscious movement of someone who is accustomed to ownership, and it hit me somewhere behind my sternum like a physical blow. "I think there's been a misunderstanding," she said. I looked at her. I looked at her for a long time. Then I turned around and walked back to my car. I drove home. I don't know how. I don't remember traffic lights or turns or parking in the driveway. I remember sitting in the car for a long time after the engine was off, looking at the front door of my house, at the potted geraniums on the porch steps that I had planted in the spring because planting things had felt like an act of faith, a declaration that I intended to continue living. I went inside. I sat at the kitchen table, the same table where Gerald and I had eaten 38 years of meals, and I put my hands flat on the wood, and I breathed. Then I started to count. $412,000. That was what the insurance company had paid me, and what I now understood was not a death benefit, but stolen money. Money obtained through fraud, through the faking of a death, through the deliberate and calculated destruction of my life and the lives of my children. I had given Karen $80,000 of it, which she had used as a down payment on a house. I had given Thomas $60,000, which he had invested. The remainder sat in my savings account, where I had been drawing it down slowly, carefully, the way you do when you believe it is the last money your husband will ever earn. But the money was only part of it. 38 years. 38 years of a life I now had to re-examine from the beginning, looking for the seams, the places where the real story showed through the one I had been told. How long had he been planning this? How long had the woman in the yellow blouse been a part of his life? How long had I been sleeping beside a man who was rehearsing his own disappearance? I thought about Karen and Thomas. They had grieved. They had stood at a graveside in February cold and wept for their father. Thomas had taken 2 weeks off work. Karen had driven 4 hours from Houston and slept in the guest bedroom for 10 days, sitting with me in the evenings and holding my hand. They had grieved for something that was not real, for a death that had been manufactured, for a father who had looked at his children's love and decided it was worth less than a clean start. The anger, when it came, was very quiet. That surprised me. I had expected something loud and shattering, the kind of anger that breaks dishes and says words you can't take back. What I felt instead was a cold, clear, steady thing, like a flame that burns without flickering, because there is no wind left to disturb it. I was not going to cry. I had already given 6 months of tears to a fiction. I went to my bedroom and I opened the box on the top shelf of my closet where I keep important papers. The box Gerald had always teased me about, calling me the family archivist. Inside it, our marriage certificate, the deed to the house in both our names, his life insurance policy, the death certificate, medical records from the hospital. I spread them on the bed and I looked at them for a long time. Then I did the thing that Gerald had clearly never believed I would do. He had always underestimated me. In 38 years, that had been his single most consistent mistake. I picked up the phone and I called my daughter. "Karen," I said, when she answered, "I need you to come to Denton. Don't bring the children, and don't tell your brother yet. I need to talk to you first." I paused. "I saw your father today." The silence on the other end of the line lasted 4 full seconds. "Mom," she said finally, "what do you mean?" "I mean exactly what I said." I looked out the kitchen window at the oak tree in the yard, at the late afternoon light moving through its branches. "He's alive, Karen. Your father is alive. And I am going to need a lawyer." That was the moment I stopped being a grieving widow. That was the moment I became something else entirely. Karen arrived the next morning. She drove through the night, and when I opened the front door at 6:15 a.m., she looked the way I felt. Hollowed out. Running on something grimmer and more durable than sleep. She was 41 years old, my daughter, with Gerald's eyes and my stubbornness, and she stood on the porch with her overnight bag and looked at me for a long moment before she stepped inside and put her arms around me. We didn't speak for almost a minute. "Tell me everything," she said finally at the kitchen table, with coffee in front of both of us. I told her. I told her about the cereal aisle and the granola and the silver Honda and the woman in the yellow blouse. I told her about the 12 feet of parking lot between us and the sound of that woman's voice saying, "Husband." I told her about Gerald's face going white and the way he had said my name, not with guilt, not with remorse, but with the stunned, almost offended expression of a man whose careful plan has been inconvenienced. Karen's hands wrapped around her coffee mug were absolutely still. "The insurance money," she said. "Yes." She set the mug down. "Mom, what he did, what you're describing, that's not just leaving someone. That's criminal. That's insurance fraud. That's—" "I know what it is," I said. "That's why I need a lawyer." His name was Robert Delaney. Karen found him. She had a colleague who had used him in a contentious divorce, and Karen had always been efficient in a crisis, had always been the child who responded to emergency by making lists. Robert Delaney was 55, with an office in downtown Denton, and a reputation, Karen's colleague said, for being methodical and entirely without sentimentality. Those were exactly the qualities I required. We met with him that same afternoon. I brought the box, the marriage certificate, the insurance policy, the death certificate, the medical records, all of it. I sat across from Robert Delaney's desk and I laid it out clearly. Everything I had seen, everything I suspected, everything I knew. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "if what you're describing is accurate, and I have no reason to doubt you, your husband has committed insurance fraud, identity fraud, and potentially conspiracy. The insurance company will want to be involved. The FBI handles insurance fraud cases of this scale." He paused. "I have to ask you something, and I need you to answer it honestly. Are you prepared for what this means? For your family? For your children?" I thought about Thomas, who still didn't know. I thought about the 4 grandchildren who called Gerald Grandpa Jerry and had cried at his funeral. "I'm prepared," I said. "Then let's begin." What followed was 2 weeks of careful, quiet work. the kind that happens in offices and on phone calls and in paper trails, invisible from the outside, devastating in its accumulation. Robert contacted the insurance company first. A man named David Park, a senior investigator for the company, came to Denton within 48 hours of Robert's call. He sat in my living room and asked me questions for 2 hours, and his expression, which began as professionally neutral, shifted gradually into something that looked like controlled outrage. "We paid this claim 8 months ago," he said, at one point, almost to himself. "I know," I said. "Gerald always was good with timing." Meanwhile, Robert hired a private investigator named Sheila Voss. Sheila was a small, quiet woman in her late 40s who dressed like she was going to a PTA meeting and moved through the world with a kind of absolute, unassuming invisibility that I came to understand was her greatest professional asset. Within 4 days, Sheila had located Gerald. He and the woman in the yellow blouse, her name, Sheila informed me, was Diane Mercer, were living in a rented house in Frisco, 30 miles from Denton. Gerald was working under the name Gerald Cole, his mother's maiden name, at a small property management firm, a career so similar to his previous one that it struck me as almost contemptuous in its lack of imagination. Diane Mercer had a Texas driver's license listing her occupation as a real estate agent. They had been together, based on what Sheila had uncovered, for at least 3 years. 3 years. Our marriage had still had 3 years left in it when he had begun building the life he intended to replace it with. I was sitting at the kitchen table when Sheila delivered her preliminary report in person, photographs included. Karen was there. Robert Delaney was on the phone. I looked at the photographs. Gerald coming out of a Starbucks. Gerald mowing the lawn of a house that was not mine. Gerald and Diane at what appeared to be a neighborhood barbecue, laughing with people who knew him as someone who had never had a wife of 38 years, had never stood at an altar in a church in Denton, Texas, had never planted an oak tree in a backyard for a daughter who was now sitting across from me with her hands balled into fists. "Is this enough?" I asked Robert. "This, combined with what the insurance investigator has," he said, "is more than enough to refer to the FBI." I looked at the photograph of Gerald laughing at the barbecue. He was holding a beer. He looked, I thought again, genuinely happy, as though no one had been hurt, as though the happiness were free. "Then refer it," I said. I didn't know yet that Sheila's car had been noticed, parked twice near their street. I didn't know that Diane, who was sharper than Gerald had ever been, had written down Sheila's license plate. But I would find out very soon. The FBI field office in Dallas assigned the case to a special agent named Patricia Horton. She called me on a Wednesday morning, 12 days after I had knocked on the window of that silver Honda. And her voice was the voice of a woman who has heard many things and is not easily surprised by any of them. "Mrs. Calloway," she said, "I've reviewed the materials forwarded by your attorney and by the insurance investigator. I'd like to meet with you in person." We met in Robert Delaney's office that Friday. Agent Horton was perhaps 45, with short gray hair and the particular quality of attention that I have since come to associate with people who are very good at their jobs. A stillness, a focus, the sense that nothing you say will be lost or mischaracterized. She asked careful questions. She looked at everything I had brought. "I want to be straightforward with you," she said, before she left. "This investigation will take time. These cases require building a complete evidentiary picture. I need you to be patient, and I need you to continue living your life as normally as possible. Don't confront him. Don't contact him. Let us work." I told her I understood. I meant it. What I had not accounted for, what none of us had fully accounted for, was Diane Mercer. She called me 4 days later. My personal cell phone, a number she should not have had. I answered because I didn't recognize the number, and for a half second before she spoke, I thought it might be Agent Horton. "Margaret," she said. Her voice was warm, composed, the voice of a woman who has decided that the best defense is a posture of absolute reasonableness. "I think we need to talk." I said nothing. "I understand you're upset," she continued. "What you saw must have been a terrible shock. But I need you to understand that Gerald left your marriage because he was unhappy. He was deeply unhappy for a very long time. He's a different person now. He's well. He's at peace. Whatever you think you're doing, whatever attorney you've hired, I'm asking you, one woman to another, to consider the consequences for everyone involved. For your children, for your grandchildren." A pause, carefully timed. "For yourself." I let her finish. Then I said very quietly, "Did you know he was married when you met him?" Silence. "Did you know he had children, grandchildren? Did you know he was going to fake his own death and let those grandchildren stand at a graveside and cry?" More silence. "Don't call this number again," I said. "The next conversation you have will be with a federal agent." I hung up. My hands were shaking, but my voice had not shaken once. I was proud of that. They escalated 2 days later. Gerald himself appeared at my door. I saw him through the window, standing on my porch, on the porch where we had sat together on summer evenings, and the sight of him there, solid and living, in the place where I had mourned him, produced in me an emotion so complex that I cannot fully name it even now. There was rage. There was grief. There was, underneath both of those, the remnant of 38 years of love. Not gone, not cleanly gone, but transformed into something that no longer had any warmth in it. I did not open the door. I called Robert Delaney. He called Agent Horton. Within the hour, I had been advised to document the visit and informed that a second visit would constitute grounds for a restraining order. Gerald left after 12 minutes of standing on my porch. I watched him through the window the entire time. He looked older than he had in Sheila's photographs. He looked, I thought, frightened. Good. The following week, a man I didn't recognize sat in a car across the street from my house for 2 hours on a Thursday afternoon. I photographed the car, the license plate, and the man, with the small digital camera that Thomas had given me for Christmas 3 years ago and which I had never used until now. I sent the photographs to Robert and to Agent Horton. The man did not return. That was the moment, I think, that Diane and Gerald understood they had made a serious miscalculation. They had expected a grieving old woman. They had expected someone who could be reasoned with, or frightened, or worn down by the sheer exhaustion of the fight. They had not expected someone who photographed surveillance cars and forwarded the evidence to the FBI. After that, for a short while, they went quiet. And I, on the advice of my attorney and the quiet insistence of my daughter, allowed myself 3 days. Karen took me to San Antonio, somewhere I had not been in years, somewhere without the oak tree and the kitchen table, and the particular weight of a life that had been built in one place and then detonated. We walked along the river walk in the evenings. We ate good food. We sat in the hotel room and watched old movies, and Karen fell asleep with her head on my shoulder the way she had when she was small. On the last morning, I sat on the hotel balcony with my coffee and looked at the river below and thought, I am still here. Whatever he took from me, he did not take this. He did not take me. I went home ready. The offer came through a lawyer, not Robert Delaney. Another lawyer, one I had never heard of, a man named Craig Sutton, who sent a formal letter to Robert's office approximately 3 weeks after San Antonio. The letter was written in the careful, bloodless language of legal correspondence, but its meaning was plain enough. Gerald Calloway, referred to throughout as our client, was prepared to make a financial settlement. The proposed amount was $200,000 to be paid in a lump sum in exchange for my agreement to withdraw my cooperation from the federal investigation, to make no further statements to law enforcement, and to characterize the life insurance claim as a misunderstanding arising from miscommunication between parties. I read the letter twice at Robert's desk. Then I set it down. A misunderstanding, I said. Robert, to his credit, said nothing. He had the good sense to simply wait. He faked his death, I said. He collected $400,000 in fraudulent insurance. He let my children grieve him. He let my grandchildren bury an empty casket. I looked at the letter again. And he's offering me $200,000 to call it a misunderstanding. That is what the letter says, Robert confirmed. What does the FBI say? Agent Horton's position is that your cooperation is voluntary, and that any decision you make is yours to make. She did ask me to note, however, that accepting this offer would not protect your husband from federal prosecution. The insurance company is a separate complainant, and the FBI investigation proceeds regardless of your personal participation. What it would do is remove your testimony from the case. I thought about that. I thought about the weight a jury might give to a wife of 38 years, standing in a federal courtroom, explaining what it had been like to grieve a man who was playing house in Frisco. Tell Craig Sutton no, I said. Tell him that I appreciate the offer and that I decline it entirely, and that if his client contacts me again through any channel, I will be adding harassment to the list of concerns I've shared with Agent Horton. Robert smiled. It was a small smile, brief and professional, but it was there. What I had not fully understood, until the weeks following San Antonio, was how much I needed other people. I am a private woman by nature. Gerald had always been the social one, the one who remembered neighbors' birthdays and organized the block's 4th of July cookout. Without him, I had retreated inward, had let the circle of my daily life contract to the kitchen table and the oak tree and the phone calls with Karen and Thomas. Thomas, by now, knew everything. I had called him the night I returned from San Antonio, and the conversation had been one of the hardest of my life. Not because Thomas fell apart, but because he didn't. He was very still on the phone, the way he goes still when he is containing something large. And then he said, "Mom, tell me what you need. No recriminations, no panic. Just that." It nearly broke me in an entirely different way. But it was my neighbor Dorothy who surprised me most. Dorothy Reeves was 70, a retired schoolteacher who had lived 3 houses down for 20 years, and whom I had always liked without ever quite moving past the level of pleasant neighbor friendliness. She brought me a casserole in the week after Gerald's funeral, and I had thanked her warmly and thought little more of it. But Dorothy had sharp eyes and a long memory, and one morning in September, about a week after my return from San Antonio, she knocked on my door and said simply, "I know something is going on, Margaret. I've known for a while. I'm not going to pry, but I'm here if you need me, and I have very good coffee." I let her in. I told her everything. It took 2 hours and most of her coffee and a box of crackers she found in my cupboard. Dorothy listened the way good teachers listen, without interrupting, without inserting herself, asking only the questions that would help me be more precise. When I finished, she sat back in her chair and looked at me with an expression I recognized. Not pity, not horror, but the clear-eyed, steady regard of someone who is recalculating you upward. "You're handling this right," she said. Those 4 words meant more to me than I would have predicted. Through Dorothy, I was connected to a small group, 4 women, ranging in age from 62 to 74, all of whom had navigated in various ways betrayals and losses, and the specific exhaustion of being underestimated by people who should have known better. We met on Thursday evenings at Dorothy's house, initially for what Dorothy called coffee and complaining, and which gradually became something more substantial. They did not know all the details of my situation. I was careful about what was public and what was not. But they knew enough, and they were, each in their own way, ferociously in my corner. I thought about what Gerald had banked on, an old woman, alone, too frightened and too tired to fight. He had been wrong about the alone, and he had been catastrophically wrong about the tired. They came on a Sunday. I didn't know they were coming. There had been no call, no letter through Craig Sutton's office. Nothing. I was in the backyard that October afternoon, sitting under the oak tree with a cup of tea and a library book I wasn't really reading, when I heard the doorbell. I went around the side of the house, still holding my book, and found them on my porch. Both of them. Gerald was wearing a gray jacket I had never seen. He looked nervous. I could see it in the set of his shoulders, the particular stiffness that had always been his tell in difficult conversations. Diane was beside him, and she was dressed very carefully, neat, conservative, a dove-gray cardigan, small pearl earrings, no excess of anything. She looked like a woman who had put considerable thought into what a reasonable person looked like. "Maggie," Gerald said. I stood at the edge of the porch and I looked at them both. And I said nothing. "We were hoping we could talk," he continued. "Just talk. No lawyers. No—" He stopped, started again. "I know I owe you a conversation. A real one. I know that. And I know I've handled things badly." He paused. "More than badly." "We both felt," Diane said, stepping in smoothly, "that a direct conversation would be more productive than all of this. Paperwork. Intermediaries. We thought if we could just sit down together, like adults, we could find a way through this that doesn't have to destroy everyone." I looked at her pearl earrings. I thought about the fact that she had called my phone and told me to consider the consequences for my grandchildren. "Come in," I said. I saw the flicker of surprise they tried not to show. They had expected resistance at the door. They had not expected to be invited inside. That surprise told me everything I needed to know about their actual confidence in this plan. I brought them into the living room. I did not offer them coffee. I sat in the armchair that had been mine for 30 years, and I let them take the sofa, and I looked at them across the room, and I waited. Gerald began with a speech I suspected he had rehearsed. He was sorry. He had been lost, had been struggling in ways he hadn't known how to articulate, had made decisions that he understood now, with clarity, were wrong. He was not asking me to forgive him. He was only asking me to consider. He was very careful with this word "consider," whether what we were now embarked upon was truly necessary. The federal involvement, the investigation. He was a grandfather. He was thinking of the children, of Karen and Thomas, of how this would land on them publicly, on their careers, on their families. I watched his face as he spoke. 38 years of reading that face. Then Diane took over, and she was smoother, much smoother. She spoke about complexity, about long marriages, about the ways people change, about how the legal system was a blunt instrument for what were fundamentally human problems. She said, and she said it kindly, in the voice of someone delivering wisdom, that pursuing this case would not give me back what I had lost, that no verdict, no sentence would undo the years, that at my age, the energy required, The exposure, the stress, could not possibly be worth it. At my age, there it was. I had been waiting for it, and there it was, wrapped in cashmere and pearl earrings. "Let me make sure I understand," I said. My voice was very even. I had been practicing this evenness for weeks without quite knowing it. "You are asking me, in my own living room, to stop cooperating with a federal investigation into fraud that robbed me of $400,000 and caused my children to grieve a death that never happened because it might be stressful for me." At my age, Gerald's jaw tightened. "Maggie, I'm also hearing," I continued, "that you're concerned about the effect on Karen and Thomas. That's interesting. Were you concerned about them in February when you made them stand at a graveside? Were you concerned about my granddaughter, Lily, who had nightmares for 2 months after your funeral? She's 8, Gerald. She had nightmares." The room was very quiet. Diane tried once more. She had clearly decided, in the absence of the reasonable approach, to try something with more edge. "Margaret," she said, "I want to be honest with you. What you're doing, the way you're going about this, it's going to be examined too. Your finances, your receipt of the insurance payment, your choices since February. These investigations aren't one-directional. People who think they're in a straightforward position often find out they're not." It was a threat, dressed as candor, but a threat. I stood up. "That surprised them, too. I'd like you to leave my house now," I said. "Both of you. If you contact me again, in person, by phone, through any intermediary, I will report it immediately to Agent Horton, and I will add it to the record. Do you understand me?" Gerald looked at me for a long moment. He looked at me the way I imagine you look at a place you thought you knew well, and are realizing too late that you never understood at all. They left. I stood in the living room after their car had gone, and I let myself feel what I actually felt, which was fear. Genuine, physical fear. A cold unease that settled in my chest and did not go away immediately. What Diane had said about the investigation being two-directional had found a target in me, had lodged in the place where my doubts lived. What if they tried to complicate things? What if they found a way to make me look complicit? What if? But then I thought of 8-year-old Lily and her nightmares, and the fear didn't disappear, but it changed. It compressed, hardened, became something that was not comfortable but was useful. A whetstone. I called Agent Horton that evening and reported the visit in full detail. When I went to bed that night, I was more resolved than I had been at any point since that parking lot in August. The indictment came in November. Robert Delaney called me on a Tuesday morning, and I could hear in his voice, carefully controlled, professionally measured, something that I recognized as satisfaction. "Gerald Calloway has been indicted on 4 counts, he said. "Insurance fraud, wire fraud, identity fraud, and conspiracy to commit fraud. Diane Mercer has been indicted as a co-conspirator. The FBI has also referred the case to the IRS, based on irregularities in the financial records they uncovered." I was sitting at the kitchen table. Through the window, the oak tree had lost most of its leaves. "When will it go to trial?" I asked. "Barring delays. Spring. But Margaret, I want to prepare you. The prosecution will want you as a witness. You will sit in that courtroom and testify, and Craig Sutton, or whoever they've retained for criminal defense, will attempt to cross-examine you. They will be looking for anything that makes you seem unstable, vindictive, or unreliable. Let them look," I said. The months between the indictment and the trial were strange and slow and populated with an enormous amount of paper. There were depositions, meetings with the federal prosecutor, a sharp young woman named Assistant U.S. Attorney Janelle Carter, preparation sessions with Robert that sometimes lasted 3 hours. Karen flew down twice. Thomas came with his wife and stayed for a week in March, sleeping in the same guest bedroom where Karen had slept in the February after the funeral, and somehow the symmetry of that, the house absorbing grief and resolve in the same rooms, steadied me. Diane and Gerald had retained a criminal defense attorney named Frank Aldrich, who had a reputation for aggressive cross-examination and a willingness to attack the character and memory of opposing witnesses. I knew this going in. Janelle Carter had told me directly, "He will try to make you seem like a grieving widow who is confused or a vindictive woman who is exaggerating. You are neither of those things. You know that. I need you to project that from the witness stand." The trial began in April. The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined from television, and more fluorescent, and the smell of it, institutional, faintly warm, paper and old upholstery, was nothing like the solemnity I had expected. I sat in the gallery on the first day, watching. Gerald sat at the defense table in a dark suit. He had aged since August. He did not look at me. Diane sat at the same table, near Aldrich, and she looked at me once. A long, direct look that I met without expression and held until she looked away. The prosecution's opening was methodical and factual. Janelle Carter was not theatrical. She presented the case the way you would explain a mathematical proof, step by step, each piece fitting precisely to the next. The timing of Gerald's life insurance purchase. 18 months before the faked death, after a notable increase in his relationship with Diane. The collaboration with a corrupt medical examiner who had since lost his license. The fraudulent death certificate. The wire transfers that had moved money between accounts in the weeks before the staged heart attack. The rental of the Frisco house, 3 months before Gerald's death, in Diane's name. Aldrich's opening was louder, faster, more aggressive. He used the word confusion 7 times. He suggested that grief could distort memory, that an older woman's certainty, however sincere, was not necessarily reliable. He said the word widow in a tone that was meant to convey fragility. I sat in the gallery and thought, all right then, your turn. I took the stand on the 3rd day. Janelle Carter's direct examination was careful and deliberate. She walked me through the 38 years, the marriage, the signs I had missed, and the signs I had not. She asked about the parking lot in August, and I described it precisely in the plain, factual language I had rehearsed, without embellishment and without tears. She asked about the Sunday visit to my living room, the threat that the investigation would not be one-directional. She asked about my granddaughter Lily's nightmares. I described them, and I watched 2 members of the jury lean forward. Then Aldrich stood up. He was a large man, deliberately large in his bearing, the kind of advocate who uses physical presence as an instrument. He began with a voice that was almost friendly, not warm, but the performance of warmth, a studied pleasantness that I recognized immediately as the same register Diane had used at my door in her pearl earrings. "Mrs. Calloway," he said, "you're certain about what you saw in that parking lot?" "Completely certain," I said. "You hadn't been sleeping well. You'd been grieving for 6 months." "I sleep fine," I said. "I've always slept fine." A flicker. He adjusted. "The man you saw, you didn't approach him immediately, did you? You followed him through the store." "I did." "And your heart was racing. You were in shock." "My heart was behaving normally," I said. "I was surprised, not incapacitated." He tried a different angle. He suggested that the therapy I'd undergone after Gerald's death, 2 months of grief counseling, which my medical records confirmed, indicated emotional fragility. I explained calmly that seeking help when one is grieving is not evidence of instability. It is evidence of good sense. He suggested that the insurance money I had received and spent constituted a kind of complicity, a willingness to benefit from the fraud. Janelle Carter objected, and the judge sustained, but I answered anyway, clearly, before she could stop me. I spent that money believing my husband was dead. The moment I discovered he was not, I reported it. Benefiting from a fraud you didn't know was a fraud is not the same thing as participating in it. I'd expect a lawyer to know the difference. There was a sound in the courtroom. Not laughter. Something quieter. The jury was watching me with attention that felt different from the attention they had paid before. Aldrich's pace had changed. He was no longer moving with the unhurried confidence of his opening. He went back to his notes. He asked me 3 more questions, each one smaller and more cautious than the last, and then he sat down. In the gallery, I could see Dorothy, who had come to support me. She gave me a single nod. I stepped down from the stand and walked back to my seat, and I did not look at Gerald. But he looked at me. The jury deliberated for 11 hours. I spent those hours in a coffee shop 3 blocks from the courthouse with Karen, Thomas, and Dorothy. We drank too much coffee and spoke very little about the case. Karen told a long, funny story about something that had happened at her son's school play. Thomas and Dorothy discovered a shared opinion about a particular kind of gardening and talked about it with an intensity that under ordinary circumstances would have struck me as peculiar. I was grateful for all of it, for the noise, for the ordinary human persistence of conversation, for the way people who love you will talk about school plays and roses to keep you in the present tense. My phone rang at 3:47 in the afternoon. I stepped outside to take the call. When I came back in, I sat down, and Karen looked at me and I said, "Guilty. All 4 counts." The sound Thomas made was involuntary. Karen put both hands over her mouth. Dorothy reached across the table and put her hand over mine and didn't say anything. I sat there for a moment and let it be real. The sentencing hearing was 6 weeks later. Under federal guidelines, Gerald faced a significant term. The 4 counts, the scale of the fraud, the elaborate and premeditated nature of the scheme, and the existence of a co-conspirator all weighed heavily. Diane had attempted, during the trial, to position herself as a woman who had been deceived by Gerald, who had not understood the full extent of what she was participating in. The financial records told a different story. There were transfers she had authorized, communications she had initiated, the lease on the Frisco house in her name signed 4 months before the staged death. Judge Sandra Weatherly sentenced Gerald to 9 years in federal prison. Diane Mercer received 5 years. Craig Sutton had negotiated nothing. Frank Aldrich's appeals to Gerald's age, his lack of prior criminal record, his charitable history, had moved the judge not at all. I watched Judge Weatherly's face as she read the sentence, and what I saw there was not indifference, but a kind of precise moral attention, the face of someone who has weighed the facts and arrived at their correct value. Gerald turned and looked at me as they led him out. I had thought about this moment. I had imagined, in the small hours of many nights over the past months, what I would feel when it came. I had imagined rage, or grief, or triumph, something large and definitive. What I actually felt was much quieter. It was a recognition, a closing. 38 years of a life, some of which had been real and some of which had not, arriving at their actual end. I looked back at him. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I simply looked, the way you look at something you are setting down after carrying it for a very long time. Then the door closed, and he was gone. The insurance company had already begun proceedings to recover the fraudulent payment. Because I had cooperated fully and reported the fraud the moment I discovered it, my legal exposure was minimal. Robert Delaney had ensured that. The house was mine outright. We had paid off the mortgage years ago. The remaining insurance money in my account was being held pending the civil recovery proceedings, but Robert was confident that my good faith status would be recognized. There were other details, practical ones, the kind that arrive after the large things are settled. The finalization of legal documents, the dissolution of the marriage under circumstances that required no contest from me, the quiet, bureaucratic work of untangling a shared life from a fraudulent one. Karen helped with most of it. Thomas handled the financial questions that required more patience than I had in those weeks. But one afternoon, in the early days of summer, I sat alone at my kitchen table in the quiet house and did something I had not done since February of the previous year. I made myself a proper cup of tea, not the sleep tea, the good tea, the expensive kind I saved for ordinary pleasures, and I carried it out to the backyard and I sat down under the oak tree. The tree was green, full summer green, extravagant and alive, rustling with a small wind. I sat there for a long time. I thought about Gerald planting that tree the summer Karen was born, 41 years ago, young and hopeful, and probably already complicated in ways I had not yet learned to see. I thought about the years beneath it. I thought about what survives betrayal, what you keep, and what you are forced to let go. I thought, I am still here. And then I drank my tea in the green shade of a summer afternoon, and for the first time in a very long time, I felt no weight at all. The first year after the trial was the year I learned what peace actually felt like. I had thought I knew. In 38 years of marriage, there had been good years. Contentment, warmth, comfortable rhythms. But much of what I had called peace had been the absence of disturbance, which is a different thing. True peace has a quality of fullness. It is the sense that the life you are living is genuinely, unambiguously yours. In September, I did something I had talked about for 20 years and never done. I took a watercolor class. I was enthusiastically bad at it for the first 2 months, and then merely mediocre, and I loved every minute. I painted the oak tree 4 times. I framed the 4th one and hung it in the kitchen. Dorothy and I formalized our Thursday evenings. A book a month. A growing group. By spring, 7 women met weekly, talking about books, gardens, grandchildren, and the particular texture of lives that have survived difficulty and come out the other side. Lily was 9 now, with a fierce interest in birds that had become my own. We bought matching field guides and argued in whispers about warblers on the porch. Thomas and his wife came for Thanksgiving, Christmas, and a random Thursday in March just because they wanted to. I drove to New Mexico with Dorothy and walked among the red rocks at sunrise, feeling very small and very alive. I repainted the bedroom a deep, warm blue, chosen with no consultation, no compromise. I loved it completely. This was my life. It was considerably more than enough. As for Gerald and Diane, Gerald was not adapting well to federal prison. Charm is not a useful currency there. He had developed real health problems. He was, by all accounts, a diminished man. Diane was released to find everything dismantled. Her real estate license had been revoked, her savings largely seized. She moved to a city where she knew no one and started over with nothing she hadn't earned the hard way. I thought about her sometimes. The yellow blouse, the pearl earrings, the careful performance of reasonableness, and felt not triumph, but a quiet clarity. She had wanted a life and chosen the worst possible method of building one. The currency she'd used was someone else's suffering, and it had not held its value. I had lived honestly. It had cost me more than I felt I could afford. But what I had arrived at, this kitchen, this tree, this life that was unambiguously mine, had been purchased fair and square, and it was worth every cent. So that is my story. I am 68 years old, sitting in my kitchen with good tea, morning light, and a half-finished watercolor of a warbler. The oak tree is visible through the window, simply and enormously itself. What did I learn? That being underestimated is an advantage if you understand it correctly. That honesty is not passive, it is a choice you make again and again under pressure. That the truth doesn't need protecting. You only have to tell it. A life cracked open at its center can be rebuilt into something real and entirely your own. What would you have done? If this story moved you, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs it, and stay for more. Thank you for listening.